Hi, I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, Editor-in-Chief of MoneyWeek magazine today, and I am here today with Alex Perry, author of this new book, The Rift, A New Africa Breaks Free. Now, the premise of this book is that Africa is not the place of misery that the Western media like to paint it as, but more a place of great excitement and potential. But Alex, I'm going to start by asking you about the origins of this book. You reported in Africa for, going on a decade.
Yeah.
What kicked things off there for you?
Essentially, from the moment I got there.
And you went as a magazine journalist.
Yeah, sorry, I was Africa bureau chief for Time magazine, and yeah, as I say, from the moment I got there, I realised that everything I thought I knew about Africa was off. We in the West we have a very narrow view that is essentially famine, war, starving babies with flies in their eyes.
Fan, of course.
Right. Well, exactly, and yes, and that view is delivered to us by the aid industry, which is an industry these days. It's the biggest business in Africa. It's $55.8 billion a year, which is equivalent to the GDP of the 20 poorest countries in Africa. It's massive. And that weight and finance and resources buys a lot of acreage in newspapers and on billboards in the West, telling us what we think about Africa. And for 50 years, the message hasn't changed, really. Africa is a starving baby, and when I arrived in Africa, I found myself, just from asking around and seeing what was going on, that I was covering not an implosion in Rwanda, but Rwanda's extraordinary revival, not a famine in Ethiopia, but food traders who were the first yuppies in Ethiopia working on Africa's first commodities exchange. It wasn't about sunsets and savannas in Kenya, it was about Silicon Savannah, the Nairobi tech scene. So over time, I guess, I built up a certain amount of anger almost with the way that Africa was being perceived, and which kind of coalesced into a book as I went along, but was particularly sparked by covering the famine in Somalia in 2011, which was the most extraordinary misrepresentation. This was portrayed in the UK, you probably remember it, it was 250,000 people died, and this was a famine that was blanketed across newspapers and billboards in London, and we were all urged to give billions to help save starving Africans, which we did. 1.8 billion was raised, and really without much investigation at all. A few days of reporting on the ground in Mogadishu, it became apparent that story of African helplessness and Western beneficence was completely wrong. That famine was deliberately caused by the US prosecuting the war on terror that wanted to starve out a small little Islamist group in southern Somalia called AlShabaab, and it had bullied the aid agencies into imposing a food aid ban on southern Somalia, and the plan had worked too well. Instead of just targeting 3,000 guerrillas, 3 million people had been plunged into famine. And
hang on, but these people were reliant on food aid in the first place.
No, they weren't. No, they weren't. And
so,
well, there was some food aid going in, and the argument that the US made to the agencies, and to which the agencies sort of capitulated, was Al-Shabaab steals food aid, so therefore you can make the case that food aid is a form of support to a prescribed terrorist group, which is an extremely serious offence in the US. The aid agencies, to give them their due, did object to this argument. The US, from what I understand, reminded them that it was their biggest donor, and that was that. And that, the US realized actually what was going on, and that its plan had worked, horribly well, and rescinded its aid ban in July 2011. But by then it was too late. Food aid takes 2 months to transport around the world. And as I say, 250,000 people died. But
no, I suppose the point that I'm interested in the very beginning of this story, which was you were saying initially that this wasn't a story about helplessness of Africa.
Right.
But then you go on to say that in fact these people were already dependent on food aid, and without the food aid, so the withdrawal of the food aid caused the famine.
But if you're, what I'm saying, in this famine, which seemed to reinforce, a long-held sort of presumption of that Africans starve in the same way that Russians drink and Arabs argue and whatever. This is what Africans do. Well, this is the one famine, in fact, there's been in this millennium in Africa, and its causes were very special. And that, combined with the sort of outrageous death toll, the scales kind of fall from your eyes. You realise that this story is just way more complicated than, a starving baby, which, let's face it, infantilizes a whole continent.
Yeah. So part of your thesis is that the aid business is so huge, and the way the aid business sustains itself, keeps going, is by spreading this myth of infant Africa that needs endless support from the West. So the pictures
AIDS
of
business
starving,
is crisis, right?
Yeah. So the starving babies are the interest of the aid business is to have us consistently believe that there is ongoing crisis, so that we keep paying, so the aid workers stay in business.
Sure, basically. And yes. I mean, look.
It's horrible.
It is. Look, these are aid workers, generally well-intentioned, quite reasonable people, understand all these flaws quite well. I mean, many aid workers are my friends. I've been to, I went to a UN conference a couple of years ago where exactly this kind of stuff was being discussed. And I was kind of amazed, because I was brought into this meeting of sort of 50 leading lights of the aid world to kind of be an agent provocateur and ask some sort of accusing questions. And I didn't need to ask any. Everybody understood this. Everybody understood that aid had a real legitimacy problem, particularly, the idea that aid workers were essentially telling Africa's story for it and were getting it wrong. And also in the sense that aid workers, still work to a very old-fashioned model, which is telling people what to do and how to behave. Celebrate your sexual diversity. Don't do that with, carbon emissions increasing technology. So on. Everyone was aware of these horrible flaws, and I really didn't have to say anything. And at the end of the conference, I walked up to someone and I said, that was kind of amazing to me. I really thought I was going to have big rows with all you guys. And this woman looked at me as though I was mad and said, oh, don't think we're going to pass any of this discussion on. This is a meeting for people who understand, but it's closed doors. It won't translate into anything. And
that's an incredibly dishonest story you tell, that the people at the top of the aid organisations are well aware of the effect of their actions, and also maybe aware that they're not actually required to the extent that they like to think they are, but carry on anyway, taking money from innocent people in the West who possibly can't afford to give, to give to people who don't necessarily need it anymore.
Well, if you
this is a horribly dishonest story.
Think about, first you have the problem of sort of institutionalisation. These institutions are just massive. How do you reform them? How do you turn them around? It's like trying to turn around oil tankers. Then you have really the problem of accountability. You raise your money over here, but you do your work over there, somewhere very distant, where there's nobody who can really check up on what you're doing. There is really no accountability. On top of that, you're doing work in areas where there's no data. South Sudan and Congo, no one's got an idea within even, a million people what the population is. So let alone how effective your aid is being.
You can't prove either way whether you've done any good or not.
And actually, that gap in data allows people to claim awesome results. It's absolutely standard aid agency practice to estimate the population of an area and say, Eastern Congo has a population of 20 million where Oxfam or whatever is working, and the suggestion is we're helping 20 million people. Congo is a great example for that kind of lack of data. It's often called the rape capital of the world, and it's also said that more people died in Congolese civil war than in any conflict since World War II. 5.4 million is the figure given. Well, the period for that war means that, given for that war, 5.4 million would mean an average of 45,000 people a month. Over 1,000 a day, every day for over a decade. That just hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. Okay, so and in fact, many people have Well, it was a survey put out by the International Rescue Committee 10 years ago. It has been consistently proved to be wrong, and it is consistently used by every aid agency in Congo.
To justify their presence in Congo.
Right. The rape capital of the world thing is kind of amazing because, so there was a researcher who went out a few years ago to research rape in Congo, as many people get grants to rape. But she asked a kind of interesting question. She asked, what was the gender of the person that raped you? And 41% came back with women. 41% of the women had been raped by women. Go figure. You know, it's a hard thing to get your head around, but it completely skewed the narrative that the aid agencies were selling, you know, which was all about gender-based equality and female emancipation and so on. And she was hounded out of Congo. You know,
for asking a question that didn't fit the story.
Exactly. So it's not just that the narrative is wrong, it's that the narrative is defended even when it's wrong, because it's so essential to keep that narrative for the business.
So if every aid agency, every big aid agency pulled out of Africa tomorrow, what would happen?
It would be a disaster, sure.
Because they're shoring up the infrastructure at this point.
Well,
$55 billion is an awful lot to be putting into
right.
a continent.
Well, I mean, it would be a disaster in terms of, I mean, South Sudan is a great example of, you know, a very new country which had almost no government and independence and still doesn't, because what 30 years or more of massive aid has taught the South Sudanese government is that it doesn't need to bother.
Because they'll do it for you.
Because other people will do it for you. So the responsibility of government, as South Sudanese ministers seem to interpret it, is to steal as much oil money as possible and give it to their people.
While waiting for everybody else
But
to...
education, infrastructure, health, that sort of stuff, other people will do that. Yeah. Again, I've sat inside a meeting in Kenya with the minister there talking about malaria prevention. The malaria program in Africa is amazing. That's an incredible example of good aid, which, by the way, is almost entirely staffed by ex-Wall Street guys, strangely, or not strangely.
Giving back, Alex, they're all giving back.
Well, it's what they did was change aid completely, and they turned this into a question of selfish incentive, really. They went round African governments saying, do you know what, if you eliminate malaria, your GDP will go up 2% and you'll all be richer. That's how they sold it. They didn't say do it from the goodness of the heart. They said do it while looking at the fatness of your wallet. Yeah. You know, and
so
it worked.
This meeting.
So I'm in this meeting, and I'm traveling with the malaria campaign guys who sort of say, so we're getting this much from the World Bank and we're getting this much from IMF, and there's other agencies are coming in, and can you guys, the Kenyan government, put in $50,000 just as a just to show willing, just as a token? No, can't do that. The health minister of malaria the health minister in Kenya can't spend $1 on malaria, the biggest killer in her country. Why is that? Because other people will pick it up.
Because she doesn't need to.
Because she doesn't need to. And you know, and frankly, there are a load of aid agencies out there that don't want her to. Otherwise, they'd be out of a job. You know, so yeah, you know, the perverse incentives of this thing are, well, they're as I say, they've been institutionalized, and deconstructing that now would be A, a nightmare, and B, some kind of disaster. I think it needs to be done, but it needs to be done carefully.
Slowly and carefully.
Yeah.
Yeah, but a good start to that would be less money flowing into the aid agencies by us in the West understanding that perhaps our money isn't required in the way that we think it is. So perhaps if the narrative changed, you would make a start on reducing the power of the aid agencies.
Well, sure. I mean, I think, you know, this absurd situation you have in the UK where we will give 0.7% of our GDP to aid. It's a blank check. At the end of last year, DFID hadn't spent enough money and just okayed hundreds of millions of dollars to anybody. I mean, it's precisely the opposite of what should be happening. You know, this stuff needs regulation and oversight like nothing else. You know, and exactly the opposite happens when you set that kind of target. Like, we must get rid of all this money. Look, I mean, in Africa, as I say, like, a lot of aid workers are well-intentioned, you know, reasonable people trying to do the right thing. However, And it is true to say that many aid workers in Africa represent what you might call the 1%. You know, if you take the total package for a UN guy in Eastern Congo, not even the head of an agency, but say someone in charge of infrastructure or infant mortality or something like that. If you add up his salary, his rent, his car, the business class flights home whenever he wants it,
Pension,
free kids education, right? It's $500,000 a year. That's more than the US president. Do you really think this guy has more responsibilities than the US president? You know, it comes from a good place. It comes from a place of the UN trying to be a good employer, but it's insane.
Well, they're still spending other people's money grossly.
And guess what? If you pay that much money, what kind of person applies for the job? The kind of guy that's interested in a lot of money. You know, not the guy that's doing it out of the goodness of his heart. Mm-hmm. You know, and you combine that with a culture in which there's almost no checks and no accountability. You know, you have a guy that messes up in South Sudan, gets promoted and goes to Eastern Congo and makes even more money. You know, it's a system, it's an institutionalized system that is, and as I say, I'm not telling you anything that aid workers won't readily, you know, acknowledge.
In private.
In private. Mm. Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, let's move away from that part of the conversation, which is beginning to upset me, and move on to the brilliance of Africa and what you see is this surge of economic growth and surge of exciting change.
Right. Well, since before I got there, since around sort of 2002, 2003, Africa's economic growth has been double the world average. You pick any one year in the last decade, you'll find 5 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African. All right, they're coming off a low base, and that early stage of economic development is often very rapid. You know, the point is to acknowledge it. You know, I mean, Angola grew by 21% one year. I mean, it's massive. You know,
I'm guessing that the statistics in Angola are not 100%
reliable.
But
sure,
it's
but
the trend
in
that
fact,
matters.
you know, again, you know, just to briefly go back to aid, never were. You know, is it in the interests of, you know, any African government to make out that it's doing okay, faced with a giant aid complex in the capital city?
Yeah, you don't want to grow 20%,
no.
do you? No.
You know, it never made sense to me that. Take Kenya again. I mean, when I arrived in Africa, the average wage was said to be sort of $600 a year per head. You know, well, that didn't really compute with the amount of Mercedes and BMWs on the streets of Nairobi. You know, guess what? People were underreporting their income to, you know, a reasonably corrupt government, who was then in turn underreporting its wealth to foreign aid donors. You know, there's always been way more wealth in Africa. I mean, right now, the average African is, I mean, you take all 49 sub-Saharan African countries, is $200 richer than the average Indian. You know, it's $1,720 a year. You know, that's a lot more than you'd have thought.
A lot more than people think.
Yeah, and that's the average. You know, so there are 160,000 millionaires in Africa. Well, millionaire just isn't a word that you think of when you think of Africa. But 160,000, that's, you know, that's a lot. Inequality, yes, is a massive problem, and you know, that builds also and corruption, and you know, builds all sorts of resentment, and you know, but development is not a smooth path to progress. It's up and down, often bloody. Was in Europe for 1,000 years, and you can expect some fairly turbulent times in Africa. But the idea that that we used to have, that these are wars about nothing that just erupt, you know, over some sort of, you know, because Africa has war, because Africa is just nuts. You know, this is about striving now, and the mood is really furious assertion, and it's pushing, and it's essentially, it's about freedom. Actually, it's about Africans achieving the substance of their freedom, and money allows them to do that. Money gives you the authority to push back at anybody pushing you around. So that's pushing back at their own corrupt autocrats and dictators who are really, you know, dying out. There's still Mugabe and a few others, but you know, really democracy is becoming more or less the rule.
You may not have much in the way of the very aggressive dictators of the past, but you've certainly got sort of semi-dictating governments in that they're, as you said earlier, very corrupt. In general, I mean, is there a government that you could pinpoint in Africa? We keep talking about Africa as an amorphous whole, and of course it's not, it's very different. A country that you could sort of hold up as a beacon of at least low corruption.
Botswana, Mauritius, although it's an absolute target for the human rights groups. Rwanda is incredible. To come back from a genocide 20 years ago to where it is now, when the whole of Kigali is wireless. And what's interesting is, and where some of these accusations come from of sort of dictatorial behaviour, is that Africa, a lot of Africa, is very definitely moving away from a Western model of development. It sees a lot more sense in following something like Singapore, where development comes first, economic development, because after all, money is freedom, and after that, we can talk about, relaxing on political freedom and so on.
So that would bring us to the relationship a lot of African countries have with China, and
right.
the infrastructure across much of Africa that China has been building.
Yeah, and I mean, there's two things to say about that. One is, obviously it's been a rapid expansion. Well, expansion. There's been a rapid increase in investment by China in Africa. It's also Africa's a kind of experiment for China of like how it's going to be in the world, and it very deliberately set out a different stall to the West, which. So when China comes in, essentially, it doesn't say, "Here's what you need to do." Here's what you should do. It asks, "What do you want to do?" It's a very simple thing, but China takes the view that Africans are probably best placed to understand what their countries want, and so that whole sort of patrician presumptuousness is done away with. And what Africa really needs, it's so vast, and what it's always needed. To become a functioning continent is infrastructure.
So roads, rail,
airports, ports, the works.
And how can those not have been built in, all those many, many years of colonialism followed by decades and decades of $55 billion a year being chucked in via aid? How can they not have built roads, airports, railways, ports?
Well, yes, exactly. That is kind of embarrassing. What colonialism built was railways and ports to get stuff out of Africa.
Yeah.
From ivory to gold to forestry, whatever. But yes, with 50 years of aid, running at anything up to...
You'd think there'd be an airport in every village.
Right. So, that has really shown up the Western approach. It's important not to overdo China's presence as well, which the West does, by the way, apparently with a completely straight face, accusing China of being imperialist. But actually, if you look at the figures, the biggest investor in Africa is France, then the US, then the UK, then South Africa, then Malaysia, then China.
Oh, interesting. That's that far down the list.
Yeah, and China, we Western business, Western diplomats overestimate it as a kind of China scare story. China overestimates it itself as a sort of self-promotion thing. A lot of the big headline deals, we're putting 9 billion into Congo, we're putting 23 billion into Nigeria, actually don't come off. They announce them, but if you wait for the substance of it, it doesn't arrive. But there's a fundamental sort of misconception in that accusation anyway, the idea that, frankly, that anybody is taking over Africa anymore is just wrong. Nobody can take over Africa now. Africa is standing up. Africa is pushing back. If Africa has loads of stuff that everybody still wants, like gold and oil and gas.
No one wants those anymore.
Timber, I don't know, cobalt. We all need that stuff in Congo for our mobile phones, right?
Yeah, rare earth.
Yes. But if Africa has all that stuff, it draws suitors, not conquerors. It's about you ask now, you don't take.
Okay. So, what are the most exciting sectors economically in Africa? You talked earlier about Silicon Valley in Kenya. Well, what's really exciting in terms of economic development? Where are the areas where we're going to see when we stop thinking about starving babies, what are we going to see coming out of
Well, there's
Africa?
a lot of sort of kind of leapfrog innovations. So that's adapting. Mobile is massive, but it's not just about mobile phones. I mean, Kenya has had mobile banking since 2007. You know,
Using
we've only
M-Pesa.
just got it in London.
Yeah.
You know, they're way ahead in that sort of stuff. And it's the same sort of thing with solar power. Kits of solar power kits are now being sold, you know, across Africa that essentially do for light what phones did for communication. You go to a shop, you buy a set almost for free, you pay it off, subscription every month, and you get light off grid in a place that has you know, abundant solar potential. But the other things that are sort of which are really exciting for growth is about Africa kind of coalescing, you know, and those are a part of it. But essentially, we're talking about infrastructure, whether it's heavy infrastructure or even sort of institutional infrastructure. So things like commodity exchanges. Mm-hmm. There's one in Ethiopia now, but there's going to be another 10 in the next decade or so across the continent. It's currency unions. You know, there is a common currency in West Africa. It seems like there will be one in East Africa, and it seems like that will eventually combine with Southern Africa, and there may be even actually one African currency in sort of 15 or 20 years' time. It's that coming together. I mean,
God, monetary union, really?
Right.
Seems like a bad idea.
but well, the idea is, you know, is essentially is that, I mean, if you took an extremely long-term view of Africa's development, the big secret to understanding Africa is that it's really, really big. It's as big as China and Europe and America all put together, and it takes an enormous amount to connect this place up. That's what's happening now. That's why things like private property and communication, whatever, are sort of taking off, and that's why Africa is arriving on the world stage.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. I did a similar interview with our mutual friend James Ferguson recently, who was much more down on Africa than you are, and talked about the vast majority of sub-Saharan Africa being an area that would become increasingly overpopulated, increasingly drought-driven, and which people would increasingly leave. And you know, a large number of the migrants coming into Europe at the moment are from that area.
Yeah.
If it's so great, why is everyone wanting to leave?
Okay, I mean, I would take a very different view. Africa has always been horribly underpopulated. That's the reason it's so poor. It needs the extra people. That will be the driver of development. In fact, the youth of Africa are the future, not just of Africa, but the world. They will be the innovators and the workers and the managers.
What if they don't have enough water?
They will have enough water because desertification is happening in some places, but in other places, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Malawi, it's being reversed.
How is it being reversed? How do you reverse that?
There was a farmer in Burkina Faso 30 years ago who took the traditional methods of farming the desert, which was essentially digging trenches. You have to try and make the earth stop, and once you stop, you can kind of water it, turn manure in it, and it will germinate. Turns out the desert isn't dead land, it's just very, very dry, but it is, if you water it, it will come back to life. Took him 25 years, but at the end of that period, he'd created a 25-acre forest in the middle of the Sahara. And he was a lot richer than everybody else because in a bad year, he could cut down some trees and sell them for firewood. So he had cash crops. He could keep animals. The trees also protected his maize and so on. And all his neighbours noticed, and it caught on to a massive extent. The extent of the regreening of the Sahara is so big it can only be seen from space. NASA has the photographs, but if you see these photographs, there is an upturned U shape in the middle of the Sahara around Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, that is 200 million trees. Which and what's doubly brilliant about that, done without a single penny of aid.
Where are the aid workers? They should be rushing to this place. It's a
Funny enough,
way they can spend money.
Quite near next to where Yaqub, the original farmer, farms, there is an Italian aid project that has spent $100 million and managed to regreen 25 acres. So it's 100 million and Yaqub by himself.
And with the regreening comes the water.
With the regreening comes a solution to climate change. The amount of trees being planted are enough to lower the temperature. In fact, you can physically feel it when you go there. It's literally 5 degrees lower. So So there is an answer to desertification. It is catching on organically without anybody's assistance. On top of that, the idea that people coming from Africa are coming to escape destitution is wrong. It costs somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 for all the different stages of people smuggling to get to Africa. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It'd be a lot of money from anybody.
But it's a lot of money, I accept, but it's also a thoroughly unpleasant and extremely dangerous thing to do.
Yes.
You would not do it if you weren't fleeing something.
No, you might well do it if you're incredibly determined. There is definitely a category of people who are generally unaccompanied children, actually, coming from, a lot of them come from Eritrea, whose families will send them to Europe as a kind of beachhead, and they will pull in whatever cash they can get, probably from relatives abroad, to fund this passage.
To fund one kid's trip.
Yeah, but the guy's coming from Senegal, it's a lovely place. Nigeria, economy is growing 7% a year. A lot of the migrants are from places not at war, not repressed, growing economically. They're coming because they can afford it themselves, and they've got big ambition.
So they don't see what you see in Africa.
I met these guys in Sicily. Well, okay, here's irony. I met some Nigerians in Sicily who were staying in a migrant detention centre who had funded themselves, and imagine that kind of grit and determination to cross the Sahara, cross a sea in a leaky boat. Yeah, these are actually the kind of guys you want to migrate to your country. They will create something. And they've been sitting in a migrant centre in Sicily for 18 months. And here's the irony. It became very clear that they were in this migrant centre for so long because the Italian mafia, which ran the migrant centre, wanted to keep them there because it was getting 32 euros a day per head off them. And the Nigerians understood this completely because, they were familiar with it.
With the way this works.
They said, this is exactly the kind of stuff we try to get away from. They couldn't believe it. They were like, you have the same problems we have? Which to me, there was great irony there, but there was a great leveler there. The other leveler, of course, to the whole migration problem is the whole idea that economic migrants are somehow, bad migrants. Well, as many Africans arriving in Sicily and elsewhere will point out fairly readily, where do you think Europe's wealth came from? Was it not from European economic migrants going to Africa? There is a certain amount of historic justice there that, while we ignore, Africans don't.
Last question. If you had to choose one African country to live in for the next 20 years, what would it be? And you can't choose South Africa or Botswana or Senegal.
Rwanda.
They
want to be the new Singapore, and they might be. The latest plan, which is a collaboration between an ex-Economist journalist and Norman Foster, is to build not just Africa's, but I think the world's first drone airport in Rwanda. Guess who would really benefit from a small bespoke aerial transport system? Well, a continent as large as Africa. Yeah, Rwanda is astounding, and the fact that the human rights groups and a lot of the aid groups can't see that is increasing monumental testament to how blind they are, and how their misperceptions are blinding the rest of us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.
We've seen price falls in the housing market in the past, in the early 90s, and they went down 50%. And I think that we're at the start of that kind of decline now, as I think indeed fairly soon we will be at the start of that in the stock market as well.